So yeah, they added this thing called GitHub Actions Reusable Workflows. So there's there we go. So they had this workflow dispatch thing where you could have a job that had triggers. Well, this isn't showing some of the trigger section, but basically you could have this sort of templatized action where you go to run this workflow, right. And it had some parameters you can specify to sort of manually invoke things. So they added something called workflow call, which is very similar in shape, and it lets you reference. Hold on, here we go. It looks like this, where basically you can reference a workflow in another repo, and it basically, for that step of the action workflow, runs that other workflow, and there's certain information you can pass across. So job workflow ref in the context of this is actually the remote identity. And so, which I think is the right identity for what's sort of executing the actual work, but it's also useful to know, on behalf of what repo it's happening, right?
Right.
And so I believe someone added a few additional pieces of extension metadata to allow you to disambiguate there. But that's some of the context.
Yeah, so the interesting use case here, at least that popped out to me, and I don't know if this is the right way of thinking of it, but I recall in the talk that Trevor Rosen did, on how SolarWinds went about solving some of these issues. He mentioned explicitly that they were not using hosted, like CI/CD tools like GitHub and Actions and others, because one of the challenges they ran into is they wanted a central security team to control some of these workflows, but they wanted other development teams to almost be mandated to use them, right? So it's almost like the policy needs to verify that the central workflow was in fact executed without any tampering. So, well, for them, what they ended up doing was they are, of course, using Tecton today, and they avoided using anything hosted. But for the rest of the world, with GitHub Actions being probably the number one, kind of system we see used, yeah, it's interesting to see how do you control certain workflows centrally and then verify that those workflows were really invoked as part of the build. Yeah, so I don't know. I see Michael has some thoughts on that, perhaps, or
yeah. So yeah, no, we have the same concerns as Trevor did. Though it is kind of funny that now he's over there at GitHub,
right?
trying to maybe fix some of those things.
Yep.
Yeah, we internally, we have literally the same exact concern, which is just we want to validate that some of these things are happening a certain way, right? We want to make sure that yes, there might be certain things that are we allow people to sort of customize or do, but largely they need to follow a certain set of steps, and that our pipeline should all be generating a similar set of attestations. It's complicated.
Can we yeah, because the first thing you mentioned, or that I thought when you mentioned that, Jim, was chains, which is really the only attestation engine. I'm probably calling it the wrong thing, but you know what Tecton Chains is. It's the only one I've used. I would look to that more than the signature to validate that certain step. I think, Jim, what you're suggesting is that maybe in the keyless issuer or collection of fields that we could infer that fact.
Yes, so tying it back to the keyless discussion and this, use case of having some reusable workflows, the model that I was thinking about is like a central security team publishing these reusable workflows, but then several development teams invoking those, right? So the two things to check there would be that yes, in fact, the central workflow was used as expected. And then it would also be nice to verify which repo invoked that and tie that back to the image to make sure that the other attributes expected in the image match the repo it's coming from.
Yeah, so I think for that to be for that combination of things, right? We have the pattern in our case. We would need sort of the running through this just for GitHub Actions. We would need to know it was the actions issuer. We would have something like this subject URL where presumably you'd require it to come from that like centralized teams repo of reusable workflows. Maybe you allow any workflow. And I mean, you could even have stuff here around like you require it to be on a particular like release version of those workflows, right? And then I think the third bit is if you wanted to contextualize that for your team's repos, you would need a third or fourth piece of metadata here, depending on how you're counting, to specify your team's repo as the sort of producer of the image that's up here in this pattern.
Right. So is it possible to have multiple subjects? I think so, right? But today it's just the central workflow, which would get inserted here. Is it possible to also add other like alternate names or something like that in the OIDC cert?
So the way so there's, let's see. So the subject is encoded either in the email field or the URI field of the cert. And then the issuer and all those extensions are using extension mechanisms. And I think there's a table of them somewhere. Maybe in full CO. So Sigstore, full CO. Let's see, what should I search for? Issuer, maybe. Hope it's marked down. There we go. OID info. So there's enormous numbers. So there's this OID that's registered, and then the dots under it, we control, we Sigstore control. And we could actually add multiple levels. There was some discussion of that. So these are the sort of currently supported extensions. I think repo and the workflow name were what were just added. Maybe this was added there too. But yeah. So anyways, this is how those different pieces of information are encoded. Okay. And the issuer was the first one that got added. And the rest have sort of been piggybacking on that. So that's a peek at how the sausage is made there. But yeah, so I think folks are going to want to be able to sort of consume these different pieces of information. I don't think we should require them to know the OID number, but we should think about how we want to express these kinds of things in the API.
Does Cosign currently pass all of these back, or is it a subset?
Cosign. So I mean, Cosign has in the JSON blob that's printed out. Not all of these are printed out today, at least as into the JSON blob when you say cosign verify with a keyless signature. But sort of internal to, I think, the sort of SDK, this is all available in the certificate that's attached to the signature. So you should be able to extract all this information. We just haven't necessarily surfaced it all into what's published there. And I think that ties back into some of the like, how do we want this stuff to be sort of printed out into that blob? And that may affect, how we want to do this, right? So it may make sense to have some namespacing like, github.blah, right? But yeah, so but I think for the sake of scoping this, I think I totally think that we should enable folks to filter on these things. But I think if we start the discussion in terms of how this manifests into the API around issuer and subject, since those are definitely the most critical, especially for the human ones, hopefully it will become somewhat clear how we might want to do it for the rest. That sound fair?
Yep.
Okay. So you pointed at these as how Caverno was doing it. I'm curious about the sort of glob semantics here. So the glob here, I'm assuming, can't have things like slashes and whatnot in it, right?
Right. So Caverno is just using a very simple wildcarding. So it's just question mark and splat, like so the star. Those are the only two things supported. There's also regex functions, but those would have to be used separately to further parse or check.
So, so where do folks think that this should manifest in our, little schema we've been working on? This seems kind of big to me. I'm just gonna zoom in a little bit. So we talked about not putting it in keyless, which is sort of why I'd gone with authorities up here instead of identities. But so we could talk about extending this bit to include it there. We could talk about adding a new section. What do folks think?
Is it the case that it would be orthogonal to keyless in the sense that if I do actually have keys and establish those some other way the identity, that it wouldn't be only part of the keyless, I guess is the question.
I mean, today it's fairly coupled, but I'm just turning off all these notifications. I keep getting buzzes from everything. I think it's fairly coupled, but I don't know what else other folks had in mind.
But yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking if we, a year from now end up in a section where it doesn't make sense, that's the only concern I would have. But
yeah. Well, we don't have a crystal ball. I think.
Yeah, I would almost advocate perhaps in the other direction, where if today it's only for keyless, we can start with that and always version this, so later we move it up.
So you're saying something like something under here,
right?
Blah blah blah. So
like the subject and issuer, or directly, or
yeah. So
or
yeah. So how do we want to do like lists? Do we want to do? I mean, there's a few other cases like sources where we have a list. We want to do a list of sort of subject, issuer. Well, I guess the tuple, but scoping it now to subject and issuer. I could say something like identities. Wish you could disable some of the like auto magic, as google.com, and then subject. This would be something like, star at example.com, something like that. Or, the issuer I'm just gonna, oops. I'm never gonna remember this token URL. Which is actually an interesting thought in terms of making this usable. I don't know if we want to, you know, I don't know. We might be stuck with it. Maybe GitHub should have thought about that. But okay, so then this is the something like the workflow ref like this. Oh, it's huge. Maybe we say something like what do folks think? Here's good. Here's not good.
I feel like it's good. I feel like we arrived at something close to this early, right? Like first instinct can feel kind of good. So
Okay.
no, I don't think this looks bad. As far as placement, I don't know that it needs to be. If it's separate, it feels like those identities end up being an identity somewhere else in a list and then named and then referenced later. If we felt like we were going to use them across multiple images to save some repetition, but I don't know how valuable that is.
I think it's huge. I can't make it.
It's never going to be the IDE you want it to be.
I know. Yeah, so I'm kind of curious about that too, and I think some of that will just come through some usage of this. I mean, again, this is sort of super verbose because we're trying to enumerate everything. I'm wondering in practice how many of these entries folks will end up having, which is, I think, where some of that repetition might, the ability to sort of use naming and whatnot to reduce that repetition will.
Sure. I mean, and then like, why not both too, right? Like.
Right. And I think we can, yeah, I mean, we can start to add other ways of doing it in future revs of the API too, and start to enable those things, I think.
You can always just hack it with the YAML, right, by using the anchors and whatever the refs are.
I'd love to see more of that in practice, to tell you the truth. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how easy it is to round trip that in tools. It might be, but it's like preserving comments and stuff like that when you're sort of processing YAML. But anyways, okay. So a third example here, I'm just going to dig it up. githubcom. Let's see, Sigstore, Fulcio. We have something today in Fulcio that we call meta issuers, and where we support globs in the, I always go to config. It's package config. Where in here we support sort of globbing OIDC issuers for like cluster URLs. Here we go. This is what I want. So I think having an example of like a Kubernetes issuer here. Oof. Take all the spaces. I did not mean I wanted you to do. So something like this, I think, I don't know. Folks may not want this. Actually, EKS is probably a bad example. The GCP one's better because you can glob out stuff like zone and cluster name, but not the project ID. So let's use that one. Of course, it's huge. All right, and this ends up being something like it's a URI form thing. Where can I find an example of this? I think it's HPS. Kubernetes. Service accounts. whatever. That's not going to fit. Okay, so globbing an issuer and subject. How would folks feel about sort of punting on additional names here and just in general aligning with what we want to put into that cosine blob that we spit out for consistency, and then we can sort of combine those discussions for moving those two things forward in tandem, because, you know, as Jim was saying, these are the only things we print out in that blob today, and we should probably expand that for both. That's okay.
So I have one question. So are we planning to verify all these identities for a signature, or is it going to be in code where we say it has to be one of these issuers and the corresponding subject?
I think it would have to be one of these things. I mean, I think most of the things that we've been doing so far, with the exception of joining policies together, has been sort of you know, a filter on the data. So I think any of these would allow, you know, a thing to pass through as sort of, you know, we have the key bit is the sort of, this is cryptographically valid. This is like the identity is valid. And then I think, you know, the default, the semantics we've been talking about is sort of, you know, a signature gets through that meets these properties, and then we're good, right?
Yeah.
So we get the sort of or semantics within cluster image policy. We get the and semantics across cluster image policy rules, where I can have n of these policies, right?
Yeah. Do we have it noted down somewhere? Because I know we talked about this, but we have to clearly say that some things have to be handled in code, and not everything is going to be specified in this policy, like this or an and.
Sorry, so you're wondering where we document the or and.
Yeah.
So I've tried to capture some of this stuff in comments, like if multiple policies match a particular image, then all of them. Yeah. So I think that's sort of the best we can document it at the schema level, and I think we want to be explicit about the semantics for each of the sort of you know, lists that we have in here. I can go through and update it for the lists we have here, but
Yeah.
but
Awesome.
I hate that this is so long. It bugged me.
Do you want to move that to an example? Like you can keep one here and move the rest to the example section.
That's a wonderful idea. Yeah, I'll do that afterwards. Okay, so move to example, and then I will also, let's see here, and I'll also make sure we've documented the and forest. Okay, so so this, I think this sort of sets my mind at ease a little bit with respect to how we capture the identity portion of key lists, and makes this sort of usable for those. Are there other, so that's, there's clearly other pieces of information that I think we want to include here. How did folks feel about the sentiment of just sort of punting on it from, you know, this narrow context, and sort of making it sort of a problem of aligning those JSON, aligning with the cosine verify JSON blob?
That's a good idea, but how do we make sure that these requirements are passed down to the SDK design? Like I'm guessing this would fall into how we are designing the SDK, right? This would be like Cosign would verify stuff and then return all the data that it verified to the webhook. or
Yeah.
whatever is
Yeah.
going over it?
I think it comes down to sharing, making sure that the SDK is built in a way that we can share code across those, right? So right now, the JSON blob that gets spit out by Cosign, right? Like if we can share a type between this and what Cosign's using to actually print it out, then those sort of necessarily stay in sync by virtue of the fact that they're the sort of same type, right? Sorry.
Yeah, got it. I think my thing that I'm not clear about is in the next steps, how are we going to make sure that these flow into the SDKs requirements? Yes, we have this ready to be presented to the wider forum and being open for a week. Then what is going to be the next step where we make sure that these requirements are like solidified and made sure the SDK is in a place where we can get all these outputs? I'm guessing this is more of a what's next question. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So in terms of next steps, right? So I mean, I think that a lot of the functionality for this is in the Cosign CLI, and like the broader SDK effort is sort of mostly about refactoring the spaghetti monster of code that's in the CLI to make it more reusable for scenarios like this today. So I mean, I think it's sort of up to us collectively to help with that refactoring. Jake's not on the call today, but he's sort of been single-handedly doing some of that with me cheerleading to some extent. You know, I did some of the early OCI stuff that he was reviewing, but I think having folks sort of help to refactor some of that stuff out so that it's more usable, I think would be helpful if that's something folks have bandwidth for. But
is there a place where like all these required efforts are listed on? Because I think from our side, we would like to offer some efforts also.
Besides the issues that, so I mean, Jim started a great doc on this. There's two issues that, well, one was the OCI issue, and the other, I forget the number of it, but there's another issue that's tracking the sort of extension of that to cover signing and verification in Cosign. Aside from that, I'm not aware of any doc from Jake or whatnot. So I mean, we can better formalize some of that as well. But I think that at this point, syncing with him and making sure we aren't repeating efforts. I don't know what he has cooking, but I think that would be the next step in terms of making this a reality, is helping get that stuff more in hand. And it doesn't have to be the sort of end state of SDK, right? Like, but you know, getting it to the point where we can reuse it in two places within the Cosign tree is a hell of a lot better than sort of the current state where you pretty much have to vendor the CLI and treat it like CLI invocations to use anything, which, you know, by contrast, right, like one of the things that prompted this is I started to try and incorporate some of the SDK bit was I tried to vendor some of that into Co, and John and Jason got out their torches and pitchforks and came after me because it added like 1 million lines of code to vendor. And when I started digging into it, it was like hard to pull out a lot of that stuff. So and it was really hard to consume really anything but like the execute this CLI command interface as code. So when we finally, now that the OCI bit's done, when we finally added like Co integration, SBOM integration, like SBOM attach integration to Co, it added a pretty tiny amount of code. So being able to like factor it out also has really nice properties on how much of your transitive dependency graph you're forcing all of your dependents to pull in. And so I think getting some better hygiene around that is also part of disentangling the spaghetti monster. But
it might also make testing a little bit easier and robust, but I know you don't like testing.
Yeah, so. That's why all my test files have to-do vicus in it. Yeah, no, absolutely, right? So making it more testable is absolutely something that I'm a big fan of, really. But
Yeah, so maybe one simple step which could help is after we're done with what we feel is a good draft version of this, we can go back and see what are all the changes needed to the APIs or SDK, and perhaps we can just label the GitHub issues that are already open on those, and that way we can start splitting up and tackling some of these.
yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome.
So do folks, I mean, module a couple action items on the doc. How are folks feeling about sharing this tomorrow? Good?
It's great.
All right.
Yeah. I did have one question on KMS, and I don't know if this was discussed before, but something which came up again from a Kyverno user was they were trying to use Vault as a KMS, and were asking about how to kind of configure. I think they mentioned there's a couple of environment variables which need to be set today, like for the Vault address and things like that. So So I was just wondering if you're flushed out all. I know we've identified, like for full CO, all of the environment variables and moved them to kind of properties. Are there others in KMS? Because I wasn't aware that these were passed as or need to be configured as environment variables.
We talked about this a little bit. Feel free to correct me, anyone. But I think, there's a comment on the one of the KMS lines in the doc that said, we should try and document how the admission controller authenticates with the different KMS systems. And I think the sentiment that we talked about last time, and maybe this is insufficient, was that we would effectively have folks configure that on the admission controller.
Okay.
And that would be how it was specified. That might not be good enough. If, for instance, if there's multiple Vault instances you want to hit,
Right.
depending on context or something like that. But that may be something we want to, explore as feedback on, the API as we
Right.
use it.
Yeah, and even if there's multiple instances, it's fine to delegate that to the admission control to the upper layer, as long as when it's calling the SDK, it configures which instance to use, and everything, of course, would be, should handle concurrent requests, so it should be fine.
Yeah. And that's yes, having better APIs for the sort of KMS pieces in particular, I think is part of disentangling the spaghetti monster, because in multiple senses, right? Each of those KMS systems, SDKs, right, like Azure or GCP or AWS or Vault or whatever, each of those have their own dependency graphs for one, but also they all have their own knobs. And right now, the extent of configurability is that like URI and the environment, which isn't very granular, right? So, but yeah, I mean, if it turns out this is completely wrong for how we integrate with KMS, we can go beyond the URI thing and introduce some, nested objects or something like that. But we should, get this out there, get some feedback. Maybe we'll get feedback really quick that this is or isn't good enough. If we find out, a month or two from now, we can rev the API if it's important enough. All
Okay.
right. Anything else, or should I stop the recording? All right. Stopping the recording.